The Man Traveling with the Oshi-e. Story by Edogawa Ranpo. If this tale was not a dream of mine, nor a hallucination born of temporary madness, then the man who traveled with that Oshi-e must surely have been a lunatic. And yet, just as dreams sometimes grant us a fleeting glimpse of another world slightly askew from our own, and just as the mad perceive things wholly beyond our senses, perhaps what happened was this: that I, looking through some wondrous atmospheric lens, caught for one brief moment an inadvertent peek at a corner of another world lying just outside the field of vision of this one. It was some warm, overcast day. I cannot say exactly when. I was on my way home from a special trip to Uozu to see the mirage. When I tell this story, close friends sometimes press me, saying I have never once been to Uozu. And when they say that, I find I cannot produce clear evidence of precisely when I made the journey. Does that mean it was a dream after all? And yet I have never in my life dreamed with such vivid, saturated color. The scenery of dreams, like film, is utterly devoid of color, and yet the scene inside that train carriage, centered as it was on that lurid Oshi-e, is seared into my memory in purples and crimsons, alive and raw as the pupil of a serpent's eye. Can there be such a thing as a dream in color? On that occasion, I saw a mirage for the very first time in my life. I had been imagining something in the old-fashioned style, a beautiful dragon palace floating in the breath of clams. And so, when I saw the real thing, I was struck with a shock close to terror, as though cold sweat were seeping from my very pores. Along the pine-lined shore at Uozu, tiny figures swarmed like specks, holding their breath as they gazed out at the vast expanse of sky and sea. I had never seen such a calm, mute sea. I had always assumed the Sea of Japan was rough, which made the stillness all the more unexpected. The sea was gray, without so much as a ripple, stretching like a boundless marsh to the infinite horizon. And unlike the Pacific, there was no clear line between sea and sky. The two dissolved into the same gray, swallowed entirely by a mist of unknowable depth. What I had taken for sky in the upper reaches of the haze was, astonishingly, the surface of the sea, along which great white sails drifted like ghosts. The mirage was like drops of India ink released onto the surface of a milky film, slowly spreading of their own accord, projected as an impossibly vast moving picture onto the great sky above. The distant forests of the Noto Peninsula, distorted by the refracting lens of the displaced atmosphere, appeared in the sky directly before me, magnified to absurd proportions, indistinct as a dark insect seen beneath a poorly focused microscope, pressing down upon the heads of those who watched. It resembled a strangely shaped black cloud, but whereas the whereabouts of a cloud is perfectly clear, the mirage had a peculiarly ambiguous distance. It seemed now like a great apparition drifting far out over the sea, and then, suddenly, like a bizarre mist pressing to within a foot of one's eyes, and finally, like a single spot of cloudiness floating on the surface of one's own cornea. It was this ambiguity of distance that gave the mirage its uncanny, deranged quality, surpassing all expectation. Vague shapes, vast black triangles, would pile up like towers, then crumble in an instant, stretch sideways and race like long trains, then break apart and appear as a row of cypress treetops. While seeming to stand perfectly still, they transformed, without one knowing when, into entirely different shapes. If the mirage's magic were the kind that drives men mad, then I surely could not have escaped its power. Not, at least, until I was on the train home. Having stood for over 2 hours gazing at the strangeness in the sky, I can say with certainty that when I boarded the evening train at Uozu and spent the night on it, I was in a state of mind entirely different from the ordinary. Perhaps it was a kind of temporary madness, the sort that grazes a man's heart and infects it, passing like a wayward spirit. I boarded the train for Ueno at Uozu Station at around 6 in the evening. Was it a strange coincidence, or is the train always like that in those parts? The second-class carriage I entered was as hollow as a church, and aside from myself, there was only a single prior passenger, hunched in a distant corner on the cushioned seat. The train ran along a desolate coastline, over steep cliffs and sandy shores, filling the air with a monotonous mechanical sound as it pressed endlessly onward. Far out over the marsh-like sea, deep within the haze, the sunset glowed dimly in the color of dark blood. Strangely large white sails drifted through it, dreamlike. It was a humid, windless day, and the occasional breeze that crept in through the open windows as the train moved was as fleeting and insubstantial as a ghost. Numerous short tunnels and rows of snow shelter pillars divided the vast gray sky and sea into striped segments as they swept past. When the train was passing the cliffs of Oyashirazu, the twilight had deepened to the point where the carriage's electric lights and the brightness of the sky seemed equal. It was around then that the sole other passenger in the distant corner suddenly rose, spread a large black satin furoshiki across the cushion, and began wrapping up a flat parcel, about 2 feet by 3, that had been leaning against the window. There was something about this that gave me a peculiar feeling. The flat thing was most likely a framed picture, but it had been leaned against the window with its face turned outward, as though there were some special significance to this. It seemed as if it had originally been wrapped in the cloth, then deliberately taken out and placed facing the window. When it was briefly exposed as the man began wrapping it again, the brilliantly colored image on its surface appeared strangely vivid, somehow not of the ordinary world. I looked more closely at the owner of this peculiar luggage, and I was struck to find that the owner himself was, if anything, more peculiar than the luggage. He wore an old-fashioned black suit of the kind one can only see in faded photographs of one's parents in their youth. Narrow-lapelled, narrow-shouldered, and yet it suited him strangely well, for he was tall and long-limbed and gave him a rather stylish air. His face was narrow and fine-featured, and would have been quite handsome were it not that both eyes gleamed a little too brightly. The hair was parted neatly and shone full and black, which made him appear at first glance to be around 40, but on closer inspection, one noticed an extraordinary number of wrinkles across the entire face, and he could easily have passed for 60. The contrast between that jet-black hair and those wrinkles that scored the pale face in every direction gave me, when I first noticed it, a start, a deeply unsettling sensation. When he had finished carefully wrapping his parcel, he turned his face toward me, and as I happened to be watching his movements with some intensity at precisely that moment, our gazes collided squarely. He curved the corner of his lips in a faintly embarrassed way and showed a slight smile. I instinctively inclined my head in reply. For the next 2 or 3 small stations, we sat each in our own corner, alternately catching each other's eye from a distance, then awkwardly looking away. Outside, it had become entirely dark. Even pressing one's face to the window glass and peering out, there was nothing to be seen. Only occasionally a distant glimmer of a fishing vessel's lantern far out at sea. In the limitless darkness, our narrow carriage alone was as though the only world, rattling on and on interminably. It felt as if the entire world, every living thing, had vanished without trace, leaving the two of us behind in that dim compartment. Not a single passenger boarded our second-class car from any station, and neither a car attendant nor a conductor appeared even once. Looking back on it now, that too seems quite strange. I grew increasingly afraid of this man. This man of such bearing as a Western conjurer, who might have been 40 or might have been 60. Fear, when there is nothing external to distract from it, expands endlessly, filling one's entire body. At last, the fear reached even to the tips of my fine hairs, and becoming unbearable, I suddenly stood and walked directly toward him in his distant corner. It was precisely because he seemed repellent and frightening that I moved toward him. I settled quietly onto the cushion facing his, and with a strange, bewildering, inverted feeling, as though I myself were some kind of apparition, I narrowed my eyes and held my breath, gazing intently into his wrinkled white face, which appeared all the more uncanny up close. The man had been watching me, as though to welcome me. When at last I was peering into his face, he gestured with his chin toward the flat parcel beside him, and without any preamble, as naturally as if it were the most obvious greeting in the world, said, "Is it this you want to see?" His tone was so matter-of-fact that it startled me more than strangeness would have. "Was this you wished to see, is it not?" As I remained silent, he repeated himself. "Would you show it to me?" I was drawn in by his manner and found myself saying something rather odd, for I had not risen from my seat with any intention of seeing the parcel. "I should be delighted to show you. I had been thinking to myself," he said, "that you would surely come to see it." As he spoke, he unwrapped the large cloth with nimble, long fingers and placed the picture frame with its face now turned forward, leaning it against the window. I glanced at the surface for just a moment. Then, for a reason I cannot account for even now, instinctively closed my eyes. I simply felt I must. After keeping them shut for several seconds, when I opened them again, there was before me something more strange than anything I had ever seen, though I find myself without words to clearly explain what made it strange. The frame depicted, in the manner of a kabuki stage set for an indoor palace scene, a view of several rooms opened up into one, with blue tatami and coffered ceilings receding far into the distance in extreme perspective, painted thickly in muddy pigments with a poisonous intensity, blue as its dominant note. To the front left, a window in the old study style was painted in deep black ink, and beside it, a writing desk rendered with little regard for proper angle. This background, one might say, resembled the distinctive style of painting found on votive tablets. That may be the closest description. Within this background floated two figures of about 1 foot in height. I say floated because those figures alone were fashioned in Oshi-e. A white-haired elderly gentleman in an old-fashioned black velvet Western suit sat in a constricted posture, and remarkably his features, aside from the color of his hair, were an exact likeness of the old man holding the frame, even down to the cut of the suit he wore. And a girl of 17 or 18 in a scarlet kanoko kimono with a black satin sash, her hair in a musubiwata style, lush as dripping water, leaned against the old man's suited knee with an expression of ineffable, coy shyness. It was, in a word, a scene of the kind found in theatrical love scenes. The contrast between the Western-suited old man and the young girl was certainly extraordinary. But that was not what I meant by strange. In contrast to the rough background, the craftsmanship of the Oshi-e figures was astonishing. The faces were made of white silk, shaped to show even the finest wrinkles in relief. The girl's hair had been planted strand by strand with real hair and arranged as one would a living person's.
The old man's head had doubtless been fashioned the same way, with real white hair planted with care. The western suit had proper stitching, with tiny buttons the size of millet grains at appropriate places. The swell of the girl's breast, the sensuous curve of her thigh, the spilled scarlet chiramen, the glimpsed tint of skin, the shell-like nails at her fingertips. One felt that if one were to look through a magnifying glass, even the pores and down of her skin would be found faithfully rendered. I had known Oshi-e only from the actor likenesses on battledores, and though even those can be quite finely crafted, this Oshi-e was in an entirely different class, wrought to the most extreme degree of intricacy. It was surely the work of a master artisan. But that was not my strange. The entire frame appeared to be quite old. The background's pigment was flaking off in places, and both the girl's scarlet kanoko and the old man's velvet had faded beyond recognition. Yet, even in their faded, flaking state, they retained an indescribably poisonous vitality, a living intensity that blazed and burned itself into the viewer's retina. That, too, was strange in its way. But that was not what I meant by strange. If I were forced to say, it was that both figures in the Oshi-e were alive. In the puppet theater of Bunraku, once or twice in a day's performance, for just a single instant, one of the puppets being worked by a master will seem suddenly to have been breathed upon by a divine spirit, and to be truly alive. These Oshi-e figures gave the impression that such a puppet, in that instant of living, had been pressed onto the board before its life could escape, and that it had gone on living there, preserved alive forever. Seeing the surprise on my face, the old man, in a tone of great encouragement, cried out almost excitedly, "Ha! Perhaps you will understand." As he spoke, he carefully unlocked the black leather case slung from his shoulder and drew out an extremely old-fashioned pair of binoculars, which he held out toward me. "Now, please, look through this telescope. No, you are too close from there. Pardon me, but would you step back a little? There, yes. That spot should do nicely." It was a most peculiar request, yet, captivated by a limitless curiosity, I did as the old man said, rising from my seat and stepping 5 or 6 paces back from the frame. He held the frame in both hands and tilted it to catch the light of the electric lamp. Looking back on it now, it must have been a truly strange and mad-looking scene. The binoculars were no doubt foreign-made, from 30 or 20 years prior, an odd-shaped prism instrument of the sort one used to see in opticians' shop signs when we were children. The black covering had worn away with handling to reveal the bare brass beneath in places, as old-fashioned and nostalgic a piece as its owner's suit. I turned the peculiar instrument over curiously for a while, then raised it in both hands to my eyes. It was at that very moment that the old man let out a cry that was almost a shriek, and I nearly dropped the binoculars in fright. "No, no! That is upside down! You must not look through it upside down! No, no!" He had gone white as a sheet, eyes wide as saucers, waving his hands frantically. I could not understand why looking through binoculars the wrong way should be so terrible. Of course. It was upside down, wasn't it? I turned the instrument to the correct orientation and quickly raised it to my eyes to look at the Oshi-e figures. As the focus came in, the 2 circular fields of view gradually overlapped into one, and something like a vague rainbow slowly sharpened, and then, startlingly large, the girl's face and upper body expanded to fill my entire field of vision, as though it were the whole world. I have never before or since seen anything appear in quite that way, so I find it difficult to convey to the reader, but the closest feeling I can summon is this. It was perhaps like the sight of a diving woman seen from a boat at the instant she is still submerged. When the diver's naked body is deep down, the complex undulations of the blue layer of water distort her form so that her body bends unnaturally, like seaweed, her outline blurring, and she seems a pale, white apparition. Then, as she rises smoothly to the surface, the blueness of the water layer grows thinner, her form sharpens, and at the moment she breaks the surface and bobs her head above water, in that instant, as if one's eyes have snapped open, the white figure beneath transforms abruptly into the living form of a human being. In exactly that same way, the girl of the Oshi-e appeared before me within the binoculars and began to stir as a full-sized, living girl. Behind the lens of the 19th century antique prism binoculars lay an entirely other world utterly beyond our imagining, where a girl with musubiwara hair and a white-haired man in old-fashioned Western dress were living a strange existence. I am being shown by a magician something I ought not be looking at. With a feeling beyond strange description, and yet utterly in its thrall, I stared into that wondrous world. The girl was not moving, precisely, yet the entire quality of her presence had changed completely from what the naked eye had shown, now full of living energy. Her pale face was faintly flushed with pink, her breast pulsed. I actually heard the beat of her heart, and it seemed as if a living warmth of young womanhood was evaporating through her garments and reaching toward me. After sweeping the girl's whole form with the binoculars, I turned the glass toward the fortunate white-haired man against whom she leaned. The old man, too, was alive within the world of the binoculars. Of that there was no doubt. But though he had his arm around a young woman some 40 years his junior, and wore every appearance of happiness, strangely, grotesquely large in the lens, his wrinkled face filling the field of vision, beneath all those hundreds of wrinkles there could be seen, curiously, an expression of suffering. Perhaps it was the effect of the lens bringing his face to within a foot of my eyes, enormously magnified. But the longer one looked, the more it sent a chill through one. An expression uniquely strange, a mixture of grief and terror.
At the sight of it, I felt as though I had been seized by a nightmare and found it unbearable to keep looking through the binoculars. Involuntarily, I pulled my eyes away and looked about me in confusion. And there it was, still the same desolate night train, the Oshi-e frame and the old man holding it unchanged, the darkness outside the window, the monotonous rhythm of the wheels going on as before. I felt as if I had woken from a bad dream. "You look rather bewildered," said the old man, resting the frame against the window and returning to his seat, gesturing for me to take the seat across from him. He fixed me with his gaze and said this: "My head seems to be doing something peculiar. It's terribly close in here, isn't it?" I made some self-conscious remark by way of deflection. At that, the old man hunched forward, brought his face close to mine, moving his long, thin fingers loosely together on his knees as if making signals, and dropped his voice to a very low whisper. "They were alive, weren't they?" Then, with the air of a man about to disclose something of the utmost importance, he hunched further still, opened his gleaming eyes wide and fixed me with a piercing stare, and whispered, "Do you not care to hear the true story of their lives?" The noise and motion of the train made me wonder whether I had misheard the old man's low, muttering voice. "Did you say their story?" "Their story, yes," the old man answered, still low. "The story in particular of the white-haired old man." From his youth? I too, for some reason that evening, found myself speaking in a slightly unnatural way. Yes, from the time he was 25 years old. I should very much like to hear it. I urged the old man on, as casually as if I'd been asking after some ordinary living person's history. The old man's wrinkled face creased with what appeared to be genuine delight, and with a murmured, "Ah, so you will hear it after all," he began the following most wondrous tale. It has been the great event of a lifetime, so I remember it well. It was in April of Meiji 28, on the evening of the 27th, that my brother came to be as you see him. Each time he said my brother, the old man looked or pointed toward the figure in the Oshi-e, as naturally as if the person were sitting there in the room. He and I were both still living under our father's roof at the time, on Nihonbashi Dori Sanchome, where our father ran a dry goods business. It was not long after the 12-story tower in Asakusa had been built, and so my brother used to climb up to that Ryonkaku nearly every day with the greatest pleasure. You see, he had a peculiar fondness for things foreign, always seeking out the newest things. This telescope, for instance, he found it in some peculiar antiques shop in the Chinese quarter in Yokohama, and said it had once belonged to the captain of a foreign ship. He told me he paid quite a steep price for it, considering the times. He spoke of his remembered brother and the white-haired old man in the picture as one and the same, as if the Oshi-e were alive and listening to his story, conscious of a third presence close beside him. And strangely, I did not find this odd in the slightest. At that moment, we seemed to be living in another world, one that overlapped our own in some way that defied natural law. Have you ever been up the 12-story tower? Ah, you have not. What a pity. That was a truly extraordinary, outlandish thing, that structure. In name, it was designed by an Italian engineer called Barton. But consider, in those days, Asakusa Park's famous attractions were the Spider-Man exhibit, the girls' sword dance, acrobatics, Gensui's top spinning, peep show devices, and the more unusual offerings were something called a model of Mount Fuji and a maze called the 80 Paces Hidden Cedar. And then suddenly, there in the middle of it all, this absurdly tall brick tower shot up out of nowhere. Wasn't that astonishing? It was said to be 46 ken high, well over half a town block, and the octagonal top tapered to a point like a Chinese hat. You could see that red monster from anywhere in all of Tokyo, just by climbing to any elevated spot. As I mentioned, it was in the spring of Meiji 28, not long after my brother had acquired this telescope. Something peculiar began to happen to him. My father was dreadfully worried, thinking the boy had perhaps gone out of his mind, and I, as you may imagine, was devotedly fond of my brother, and his strange behavior troubled me terribly. What was he like? He scarcely ate, would not speak with anyone in the household, and when he was home he shut himself in his room and did nothing but think. His body grew thin, and his face, always pale, turned the color of clay, like someone ill with consumption, with only his eyes rolling feverishly. And yet, for all that, every single day, as reliably as going to an office, he would wander out from around noon until dusk, going heaven knows where. When asked, he would not say a word. Our mother tried every means to find out what was troubling him, but he would not open up. This went on for about a month. I was so worried that one day I quietly followed him to find out where he was going. Our mother had asked me to do so. That day, like today, was overcast and unpleasant, but just after noon he put on his black velvet suit, the most fashionable thing to be seen in those days, custom-tailored to his own design, slung this telescope over his shoulder, and went weaving off toward Nihonbashi Dori and the horse-drawn trams. I followed behind, taking care he would not notice. You follow me? Then, my brother waited for a horse tram bound for Ueno and hopped aboard.
Unlike today's electric trams, you cannot simply board the next car and give chase. There were so few cars, you see. So I had no choice but to dip into my pocket money from Mother and take a rickshaw. As long as a rickshaw puller had some spirit to him, following a horse tram close enough not to lose it was perfectly simple.
When my brother descended from the tram, I descended from the rickshaw and followed him on foot again. And the place he led me to, why, it was none other than the Kannon Temple at Asakusa. My brother went straight through the market arcade, past the main hall, through the clusters of sideshow booths behind it, making his way through the crowds, and came to a stop before the 12-story tower I had just been describing. He passed through the stone gate, paid his money, and disappeared inside through the entrance beneath the sign reading Rionkaku. I had never imagined in my dreams that he had been coming to such a place every single day, and I was quite dumbfounded. Young as I was not yet 20, I remember thinking quite strangely that perhaps my brother had been bewitched by the spirit of the 12-story tower. I had only been up the tower once before, taken by my father, and had not been back since, so I felt vaguely uneasy. But as my brother had gone up, there was nothing for it, so I followed him up those dim stone stairs, a floor or so behind. The windows were small and the brick walls thick, so it was cold and damp, like a cellar. And being during the Sino-Japanese War, paintings of battle, unusual for those times, hung in a row along one wall. Japanese soldiers with expressions like wolves howling as they charged. Chinese soldiers with bayonets through their ribs, pressing at their gushing wounds with both hands, faces and lips turned purple, writhing. Severed bianfa-braided heads flying up into the air like balloons. Lurid, blood-soaked oil paintings that gleamed oilily in the dim light from the windows. Between them, the gloomy stone stairs spiraled upward without end, like the inside of a snail's shell. It was a truly peculiar, unsettling experience. The summit was an octagonal open gallery, just a railing with no walls, and when one reached it at last, the light opened up brilliantly all at once, and after the long, dim ascent, it came as quite a shock. The clouds hung low, as if one could reach out and touch them. Gazing out, the rooftops of all Tokyo were jumbled together like rubbish, and the fort at Shinagawa looked like a miniature stone garden. Fighting back vertigo, I forced myself to look straight down. Even the main hall of the Kannon Temple was far below us, the sideshow tents like toys, the people walking about visible only as heads and feet. There were about a dozen sightseers gathered in a cluster at the top, looking nervous and whispering to one another as they gazed toward the sea at Shinagawa. But when I looked for my brother, I found him at a distance from them, alone, with the telescope pressed to his eye, sweeping it ceaselessly across the temple grounds below. Seen from behind in that moment, he stood outlined sharply against nothing but whitish, murky, undulating cloud, his slim, velvet-suited figure floating up against it clearly, the sky moving while he stood still, so that it seemed as if he were drifting through the air. There was something about it, divine almost, that made one hesitant to speak to him. He looked like a figure from a Western oil painting. But remembering my mother's instructions, I could not stand there forever, so I approached from behind and called out, "Brother, what are you looking at?" He started and turned, but his face was closed and he said nothing. I said, "Father and Mother are terribly worried about your behavior lately. I have been wondering where you go every day, and it seems you come here. Please tell me why. At least confide in me, your closest companion." And there, with no one nearby on top of that tower, I pleaded with him urgently. He was slow to open up,
but I persisted until he had no resistance left, and at last he told me what had been weighing on his heart for that whole month. And the cause of his anguish was, well, it too was a most extraordinary thing. He told me that about a month before, when he had been up the 12-story tower sweeping the telescope across the temple grounds, he had caught a brief glimpse among the crowd of a girl's face. She was beautiful, beyond any beauty of this world, he said. And though he had always been quite indifferent to women, this one girl in the telescope made him shudder, and he was completely undone. He only caught one glimpse before, startled, he lowered the binoculars. When he tried to find her again, searching desperately in the same direction, the lens would not find her face again, no matter how he tried. At that distance, through a glass, with all those people, once lost, there was no certainty of finding her again.
From that day on, he could not forget the beautiful girl in the lens. Being a very reserved person, he began to suffer in the old-fashioned way, lovesick. People nowadays may laugh, but people of that era had a genuine leisureliness about them, and it was not uncommon for a man to fall in love with a woman glimpsed in passing and be taken ill with longing. Needless to say, it was that wasted body of his that he dragged every day to the tower, climbing up and searching through the telescope, sustained by the faint, hopeless hope that perhaps the girl might pass through the temple grounds again. Love is a strange thing. 6.0. When my brother had unburdened himself to me, he went back to the telescope as if stricken with fever. I, for my part, was filled with sympathy for his situation. Hopeless as it was, a search against 1,000-to-1 odds, I had no heart to tell him to stop. I was so moved, I stood near tears watching his back. And then, I cannot forget that wondrous and beautiful spectacle. It was over 30 years ago now, but if I close my eyes, those dreamlike colors float up before me as vividly as ever. As I said, I was standing behind my brother, and nothing was visible but the sky. My brother's slender, suited figure floating up against the murky, shifting clouds, the clouds moving so that it seemed he was drifting through the air. And then, all of a sudden, like a burst of fireworks, countless red and blue and violet balls began floating upward through that whitish sky, one after another, soft and drifting, rising and rising. It was truly like a painting, and like an omen of something, and I was filled with an indescribable sense of wonder. What could it be? Looking quickly down below, I could see that somehow a balloon seller had blundered and released all his rubber balloons at once into the sky. Rubber balloons were far rarer then than now, so even when I knew what they were, I still had a strange feeling about them. Oddly enough, whether it was connected or not, it was at just that moment that my brother suddenly seemed extremely agitated. His pale face flushed pink. He caught his breath, came toward me, seized my hand, and said, "Come, quickly, we must not be too late," and pulled me along with great urgency. As we ran down the stone stairs of the tower, and I asked what had happened, he said he had finally found the girl. She was sitting in a wide room with blue tatami, so we had time. She would still be there when we arrived. The location he had identified was behind the cannon hall, with a large pine tree as his landmark, where he said there had been a wide room. But when we went together and searched, the pine tree was certainly there, but there were no buildings of any sort nearby. It was as baffling as being deceived by a fox. I thought it was simply his imagination, but he looked so wretched that for consolation's sake I asked at the tea shops and refreshment stalls thereabouts, and found no shadow or trace of such a girl. In our searching, we became separated,
but after making a circuit of the tea shops and returning after some time to the foot of the pine, I found, alongside the various street stalls, a peep show booth, the showman snapping a whip with a cracking sound as he called out his wares. And there was my brother, half crouching, peering intently into the peep show lens. "Brother, what are you doing?" I tapped his shoulder. He spun around in surprise, and I have never forgotten his face at that moment. How shall I put it? He seemed to be dreaming. The muscles of his face had gone slack. His eyes were focused on something far away, and even his voice as he spoke to me sounded strange and hollow. And he said, "That girl we were looking for, she is in here." So I quickly paid my fee and looked into the peep show lens, and it was a scene from the story of Yaoya Oshichi. The scene showing Oshichi leaning against Kichisa in the study of Kichiji Temple had just come up. I remember it as clearly as if it were yesterday. The husband and wife showman team were singing together in hoarse voices, beating time with their whip. "Hiza de tsuratsurai te, me de shirase." Press your knee and signal with your eye. Ah, that strange melody of "Hiza de tsuratsurai te, me de shirase." I can still hear it. The peep show figures were in Oshi-e, but they must have been made by a master. The lifelike beauty of Oshichi's face. Even I felt she seemed truly alive, so it was no wonder my brother said what he said. He told me, "Even if I know this girl is only a made-up Oshi-e, I cannot give her up. Sad as it is, I cannot give her up. Just once, only once, I want to become a man inside the Oshi-e, like Kichisa, and talk with this girl." And he stood there, dazed, just standing still, making no move to leave. Come to think of it, the peep show must have been open at the top to let in light, and from that angle it would have been visible from the top of the 12-story tower, slantwise. By then the sun was beginning to set, the crowd was thinning, and in front of the peep show only 2 or 3 children with bobbed hair lingered reluctantly, drifting about. The overcast that had hung over us since noon now pressed lower in the dusk, bringing with it the feel of imminent rain, the most oppressive kind of weather, the kind that might make you feel you were going mad. And in one's ears there was a sound like a distant drum roll. In the midst of all that, my brother stood motionless, his eyes fixed on something far away, standing there for what seemed a full hour. When it was quite dark, and the fire balloons of the distant acrobats' show had begun to flutter and gleam beautifully, my brother snapped to, as if from sleep. He suddenly grabbed my arm and said, "Ah, I have just thought of something. Please, do me this favor. Look through this telescope upside down, with the large glass to your eye, and watch me through it." It was a strange thing to ask. When I said, "But why?" he only said, "Never mind the reason, just do as I ask." The truth is, I have never much liked optical instruments, telescopes, microscopes. There is something uncanny to me about the way distant things leap toward you, or tiny creatures grow as large as beasts. It is a creature-like quality that I find unsettling. So even my brother's precious telescope I had seldom looked through, and the less I used it, the more it seemed to me a demonic instrument. And now, in the gathering dark on the lonely grounds behind the Kanon Hall, to look through it upside down and watch my brother, it was mad, and it was eerie. But as he pleaded so earnestly, I could not refuse, and I did as he asked. Looking through it upside down, my brother, standing 2 or 3 yards away, shrank to about 2 feet, and in his smallness appeared with a particular sharpness floating out of the darkness. Nothing else was visible, only my brother's small, suited figure standing alone at the center of the glass. Then, he must have begun to walk backward, slowly. I watched as he grew smaller and smaller, until he had become a figure about a foot tall, like a little doll. And then that figure seemed to rise gently into the air, and in an instant had dissolved into the darkness. I was frightened. You may think me foolish for saying so, but in that moment the fear was genuine. It went right through me. I pulled the glass away from my eye instantly and called out, "Brother!" and ran toward the place where he had disappeared. But search as I might, there was no trace of him anywhere. By the time elapsed, he could not have gone far, and yet nowhere could I find him. And that, my friend, is how my brother vanished from this world forever. From that time on, I became even more afraid of optical instruments, of what I call their demonic nature. Above all, this particular glass, which had belonged to some unknown foreign ship captain, I found especially sinister. Other telescopes I cannot speak to, but this one, I was absolutely certain. It must never be looked through upside down. To look through it upside down would invite catastrophe. That is my firm belief. Now you understand why I was so alarmed when you held it upside down just now.
But when, after a long and exhausted search, I returned at last to the front of the peep show booth, it came to me all at once. My brother, consumed by love for the Oshi-e girl, had borrowed the power of the demonic telescope to shrink his own body to the size of the Oshi-e girl, and had quietly crept into the world of the Oshi-e. And so I asked the showman, who had not yet packed up his things, to show me the scene at Kichiji Temple. And there, my friend, sure enough, my brother had become Oshi-e, and in the light of the lamp, he was sitting in Kachisa's place, his face full of happiness, embracing Oshichi. And yet, I felt no sadness. I was moved to tears with gladness for my brother, who had at last achieved his heart's desire. I made a firm promise to the showman that no matter the price, he would sell me the picture. Strangely, the showman seemed not to notice at all that a Western-suited figure had replaced the young page, Kachisa, and flew home to tell everything to our mother. But father and mother both said, "What are you talking about? Have you gone out of your mind?" And no matter what I said, they would not believe a word of it. Isn't that absurd? The old man burst out laughing as if he found it utterly comical, and strangely, I laughed along with him, genuinely in sympathy, doubling over with laughter myself. They simply could not believe that a human being could become an Oshi-e. But as proof that he had become Oshi-e, was it not the case that after that, my brother's form vanished completely from this world? And even that those people explained away as he must have run off from home. A wildly mistaken guess. Isn't it funny? In the end, regardless of what anyone said, I begged money from my mother and obtained the peep show picture, and took it with me on a journey from Hakone toward Kamakura. Because, you see, I wanted to give my brother a honeymoon. Riding the train like this, I cannot help thinking of that time. Just as today, I leaned the picture against the window and let my brother and his beloved see the scenery outside. How happy my brother must have been. And the girl, too. How could she resent such devotion? The two of them were like true newlyweds, blushing shyly, their skins touching, talking together in tender, unending whispers. After that, my father gave up his business in Tokyo and retired to our ancestral home near Toyama, and I went with him and have lived there ever since. But it has now been more than 30 years since then, and I thought I would show my brother the changed Tokyo. So that is why I am traveling with him now. But here, my friend, here is the sad part. The girl, alive as she is,
was made by human hands to begin with, and so she does not age. But my brother, even as Oshi-e, is at root a human being with a natural lifespan, forced into a new form against his will. And so he ages just as we do. Look at him. The beautiful young man of 25 has gone quite white-haired, and ugly wrinkles have come over his face. How sorrowful for him. His companion remains forever young and beautiful, while only he grows old and worn. It is a terrible thing. My brother wears a sorrowful expression. For the last several years, he has always had that look of suffering. When I think of that, I cannot help but feel sorry for him. The old man gazed in silence and shadow at the old man in the Oshi-e. Then, as if suddenly coming back to himself, what a long story I have told. But you understood, didn't you? You won't call me mad as others do? Then it has been worth telling. Now then, my brother and his companion must be tired as well, and they must be quite embarrassed having that story told about them right in front of them. Well, I will let them rest now. So saying, he gently wrapped the Oshi-e frame in the black cloth. In that instant, whether it was my imagination or not, the faces of the Oshi-e figures seemed to shift ever so slightly, and at the corner of their lips, a bashful smile seemed to be sent toward me, like a small farewell. After that, the old man fell silent. I, too, said nothing. The train, as ever, went on with its dull rattling through the darkness. After about 10 minutes, the wheels slowed. Lights flickered 2 or 3 times outside the window, and the train pulled into a small mountain station, unknown to me. A single railway employee stood alone on the platform. Then I shall take my leave. I am to stay the night at a relation's here.
The old man stood with a light hop, cradling the wrapped picture, left this brief farewell, and stepped out of the car. Watching from the window, I saw his tall, thin figure, how exactly it was the figure of the old man in the Oshi-e, pass through the simple gate, hand his ticket to the station employee, and then, like smoke, dissolving into shadow, vanish into the darkness beyond. 8.0